Hi, everyone. Welcome to your weekly edition of Between the Vines. I'm Jennifer Phillips Russo here with Kevin Martin, and this is the Cornell and Penn State University podcast for the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program. Thanks for joining us and tuning in. Today, we have a couple things to talk about. Tevin, your name is Tevin now. Kevin wants to discuss some pricing that we were talking about last week to give you a little more information and updates on that. And I'll talk about the current state of where some of our berries are at, and welcome. Okay, Kevin, you can start us off.
Sure. The first thing I want to say is we are going to come out with probably a Zoom meeting for December, so Hans and I can discuss some of this information in more detail. And once we get a chance to digest it in terms of where we think things are headed, what that gives us is an idea of what grape juice processors are doing as well that are cooperatives, because we get some idea of what's happening there by December. But what we have right now is the preliminary result of the wineries that responded to the Finger Lakes survey. We also have price announcement data, which is what we use in the Lake Erie region. And I think not so much as a result of the different geography, although that probably is some of it, but also just based on how we get our data and where we get our data from and who those processors are. We're seeing trends that are a little bit different in the Finger Lakes than what we're seeing in the Lake Erie region. And that's maybe a bit of a misnomer because, I would consider, for example, Gallo a really important winery that a lot of our industry in the Lake Erie region delivers to. And so I include that data in the information for the Western New York grape prices and PA grape prices. But that's obviously, so there's a lot of cross pollination between the Finger Lakes and where grapes are sold. But in general, one of the more interesting things that's very different is the white hybrid market actually looks better than, say, the red hybrid market in the Finger Lakes. The white vinifera market looks better than the red vinifera market in the Finger Lakes. And I think it's also important to put that into context in that everything looks pretty good right now. There's a couple of varieties that are lagging, but 75 to 80% of varieties are hitting prices that are at least close to their historical highs, certainly close to historical highs that aren't created by a severe shortage. Like, oh yeah, remember that time we got $2,500 a ton for lousy Cabernet when, we had one or a quarter of a ton to the acre. Like, we didn't actually get any money for it. It was just this theoretical price. But prices are pretty healthy considering, at least in the Lake Erie region, volumes aren't bad either. So we have that going for us, and it's been going for us for a couple of years. Most of the price increases are single digit on most varieties, but they're coming again from a fairly strong 2021, a fairly strong 2022, and even all the way back to probably 2020. Most things have been strong. Now it's more things. Back in 2019, there were a few varieties. I think Diamond was one of them. Prices were pretty depressed. And in the Finger Lakes, we don't see very many varieties like that right now. In the Lake Erie region, and I said this in the crop update, and I think I said it last week in the podcast, there are a couple varieties, specifically depending on what processor you're marketing to, where prices really aren't terribly good. And we don't see those trends in the Finger Lakes. And so I guess what I would say is just, and I would say that it is very important to make sure that you are diversified when you start getting involved in hybrids and vinifera. They're very similar business operations. If you can learn how to grow vinifera, you can definitely learn how to grow hybrid. And there are just going to be years where, something is in demand when something else isn't. And the other thing is some of these varieties will fall off the radar, and they might do that for 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, or forever. And so if you're all wrapped up in just a couple of varieties and you get stuck with a variety that is in a long-term slump not because of production concerns, like everybody had a huge crop last year, but because consumer tastes changed, you don't want to be overexposed to one particular variety. And we're not seeing a lot of that right now because I think there's a little bit of a shortage. So most things are being repurposed in the Finger Lakes. And then the other thing that happens is if you hold on long enough, it'll probably eventually come back. Baco prices in Western New York are pretty high. I don't think anybody ever thought Baco was going to come back. I think it's been hard to sell Baco for 20 years. I mean, a few people did it. They had wineries they built relationships with. Those wineries need Baco. It was fine for them, but a lot of other people, they lost their market, and trying to find another one that paid a decent price took 10 years. So we're there now. But I do think, and the other big takeaway I would say is, in Western New York, in Pennsylvania, the price of Concords has gone up more than it has in the Finger Lakes. And I sort of commented on this before, and I'm not sure if I'm right or wrong, because there's some other data that seems to contradict what I'm saying. But at least with Concord, it appears as though the market's a little bit healthier if its intended final use is geared towards juice rather than wine this year. That trend's been around for a little bit. I think we've seen some of the processors that do both juice and sales to wineries have seen that there's not much of a premium for wineries, or sometimes there's even, if there is a premium, the premium's not justified because you're selling in smaller volumes. So there's not really a premium. So we are seeing that trend in our region, and this is different than the Finger Lakes. We're seeing that pretty much across natives. You have Niagara, which could theoretically be used for wine or juice, and we're seeing where same thing. The market for Niagara juice is probably not great at all in our region, but it's worse when it's being sold to wineries. And a little bit different in the Finger Lakes. They've actually seen price increases in Niagara, which is not something we've seen as a general trend. I don't know what's going on there. So maybe it's not just the intended use for wine. Maybe I really don't know. I do feel like that's what we're seeing in our region, and it just appears to be a little different in the Finger Lakes. Seeing that across all other natives, like most other natives, they're used just in wine. Maybe there's a little juice here and there, but not by major processors. Those prices are hit a little bit harder, certainly as you compare them to Concord, Niagara, and they're down a little bit in Western New York. Not so much in the Finger Lakes. They are seeing price increases. One thing I did do, because I think prices went up sooner in the Finger Lakes, as we saw this sort of rush to raise prices since they bottomed out a few years ago. And when you look back towards 2019, the trends are a little more mixed. So, you've got Cab Sauv that's up 7% since 2019. Riesling is up 8%. Concord's up 20%. So those are all good. I don't know that 7% and 8% is, hitting it out of the park, but I think it's just enough to sort of cope with inflation. But they're not universal trends. And, Pinot Noir prices are unchanged over the same period. So even though we're seeing almost all prices go up in 2022, when you look back to 2019, it's pretty flat. Save all prices are down 5%. So again, diversification, marketing to specific wineries, and establishing those relationships, because it's really not unusual to see prices vary by 25% within the same variety, depending on where you're selling it. That could be for juice, it could be for wine, it depends on what's going on. Concord prices are pretty close together right now for juice, and pretty close together for wine. But certainly when there's a surplus, we definitely often see spreads like that. So, that's one way to shield yourself from some of the negative impact of falling prices. And this is usually the time to do that, to cultivate relationships, because this is the time where people want things. So, you can just make them beg for it, give them low quality, and, pit them against each other and make sure you get the highest price. Or you can try to, see if you can build those relationships and, make sure that there's trust between the two of you. So this is your opportunity to do that. And, if it doesn't work out for you, if you're the first one that's cut, even though that's the relationship you're trying to build, then, in the future, you try to build a relationship with somebody else.
If you're cut, yeah.
Well, the bargaining power shifts just like it does in everything in life, right? Like, is it a buyer's market? Is it a seller's market? And unlike selling a house, this is one of those areas where these relationships can be very long term. So, you get a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma thing happening here, where you can actually benefit through cooperation rather than just seeking out maximum profits in the short term.
Well said.
I did mention inflation. I'll just mention it really quickly. One takeaway, when we start trying to compare the Finger Lakes to the Lake Erie region, it's not necessarily a regional thing. But what I would say is one of the biggest changes in our cost structure for Concord production has been grape posts. A lot of people had 15 ton of the acre, so they had more broken posts. The price of posts doubled. So per acre, that was our biggest change in cost. Herbicides were a close second, and following not too far behind was labor. Anything that's a vinifera particularly, but probably really anything that requires manual canopy management, you're going to see labor costs leading the way in terms of what's fundamentally driving price increases or expense increases on your farm. And a lot of times when that is the case, you're looking at over-engineered trellis systems. So, they crop 3-4 ton to the acre and they have a metal post at every vine. So regardless of whether or not the price of posts or labor surrounding maintenance of canopy or wire has changed, that's not a sticker shock to vinifera growers as much as it is Concord growers. Not to say that they don't spend a lot of money on trellis, but overall the maintenance cost as a percentage is going to be a lot lower. So that they will see labor costs, if they're doing canopy management during the growing season, lead the way.
You said that word and all of a sudden I was like, shock.
What's that? Which one? Which word?
That labor word that I know is going to be.
No, we don't need to get into it. I think it's important to keep into context some of these higher prices, especially if they're single digit price increases. I think 7%, 8% since 2019. If you're doing what I would refer to as like chained management, meaning you switch to a lower cost good where available, and you don't necessarily just do the exact same thing that you were doing in 2018 when Roundup was $8 a gallon, you should be maintaining similar profit margins. If you are heavily reliant on, say, Saval, where prices are down 5%, they could be in your situation, then obviously things are a little bit more difficult. And that's where hopefully you already have diversification and marketing options, and you can position yourself to think strategically about where you're going with your variety mix. That's all.
Yeah, understood. So the point of us having this podcast is basically to get out that timely information that sort of echoes what our crop update is. Mm-hmm. I don't want to take away from any more of your pricing. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add about your price update?
No, that was pretty much my crop update. So please don't get irritated if you're going to read the crop update and expect even more information. But there's a limit on how much information we're going to provide. And sometimes we're just trying to deliver it different ways. So
exactly. So I guess I'll just start really kind of going through what our crop update was. And next would be mine, talking about what's going on in the vineyard. Lots of things are going on. I've been in a couple of vineyards and I've had some growers calling me about some shelling, some berry splitting. We touched base, I think, on it a little bit last week. And of course, the rain has continued this week as well. So I have noticed that there's been where that shelling has occurred, there's been more berry moth damage, potassium deficiency. All you have to do is really sort of look out across the vineyards as you're driving down the road. You can see the black leaves, hint of it in here and there. And it's to be expected. I know everybody had a huge crop last year, and with the cost of inputs of potash and whatnot, some people made some decisions. But I think it's where you have to think about a healthy vine like a healthy body. So you have these stressors like grape berry moth, and you have a stressor like phomopsis and the mildews, and even just possibly a water stress here or there. If your vine is healthy going into the season to begin with, it's going to fare better when there are the shelling and the rain coming on. Then if you've had all of these, you have a cold and then you get an infection after that. So your body just can't fight things off as they could if it was healthy.
I do wonder, Jen, and maybe you don't have an answer, and maybe I think if you don't, I'm just going to raise the issue so like as a grower, you can think about it in terms of how you manage. So like I mentioned, sort of chained production costs where you actually lower your costs when you can. And so I think if you've listened to our podcast, my philosophy is potash is almost never one of those one of those areas where you can. We did talk about some specific instances where you might be able to
Right.
over the last year because prices are so high, but they're never instances where you're going to see potassium deficiency in a year that has okay moisture um, and a medium-sized crop,
Yeah.
which is sort of where most of our growers are at now. I mean, it's been raining. Most growers don't have 20 ton to the acre. I do know that there are some that are overcropped, but I guess where I'm trying to get to that is, what do you think is driving that deficiency? Do you think those are management decisions where they cut back on potassium, or do you think there was a lack of modification to their practices because, they're used to putting down 100 or 200 pounds and then they had this gigantic crop and whatever they were putting on annually was just inadequate? So it wasn't necessarily a strategic cost saving measure. Maybe it was just a management thing, or was it just that early season dry weather? And they did what they thought they needed to do, and the weather kind of bit them a little bit, or a combination of all three.
I do appreciate your question, and I've asked the same questions. And in my mind, I think this year I expected to see it everywhere, and I expected to see it due to the crop last year. So I think your option B or two, when you were stating possibly just you were putting down potash, but it just wasn't sufficient as what it was supposed to be for last year's crop, right?
Right.
So I do think some people did cut back because of the price of potash, but I don't think that's the majority of the belt. And then, yes, the dry weather during that rapid shoot growth could possibly be a factor as well. All good research questions to look into because we know it moves.
Yeah, I mean, if that is the case, just theoretically, if you are right, or if you're a grower listening and you're saying, yep, that's what I did, and that's the problem, I would encourage you to try to manage your way out of that type of potassium deficiency. Even at $1,000 a ton, if you see that you have 15 ton to the acre, put down a little more potassium than you're accustomed to putting down. I think there's probably some research that might indicate you can't manage your way out of dry weather. I think it's
irrigation. Who's going to do that?
Right. But I think it's probably still worth a try to a certain extent, especially when potassium is cheaper, which it isn't right now. Because in a year like this year, we had very dry weather, right? And then when it wasn't dry, I'd like to see that potassium available and moving so that maybe your vine can catch up, or at least it minimizes the impact. Because as much as we have drought stress more often than we would like to, and maybe more often than we historically have, it seems like what we really have is pretty volatile weather in recent history. So that drought ended very quickly. It never got started. We didn't have a drought. And that's happened a bunch of times where in the end, we end up getting rain. And so be ready for that, right? Like, don't just say it's a drought and we're screwed. Maybe we can do something in those years where we just need to be a little more fit with our vine health and available nutrients so that when things get better, like they did, or I guess wetter, I shouldn't say better, right? Because the next thing we know, we're going to turn around, it's going to be too wet. Who knows? But when you get that opportunity, you can take advantage of it.
Thank you for that. I do have some updates from Dr. Terry Bates on the Concord berry curves. So his team monitors it weekly, and then he puts out his Concord, it's called the 2022 Lake Erie update, and it's the fresh berry weight curve and juice soluble solids. So he's talking that the phenology block, we've talked about that in the past. Those are a certain set of vines that are set to a certain set of bud numbers, and we watch them throughout the growing season. That's where on our website, when you see what phenology we're at right now in the historical phenology, it's those vines that we take that information from. So same with the bricks, same with the berry weight. And he had said that while berry weight right now is starting to plateau, and it normally does at this time, just before harvest, the berry weight gets to about where it is, and it kind of hangs there for a little bit. It is higher than the 22-year average, yet it is lower than 2017. It's just above 3.0 gram berries. And that's on average, remember, that's not just taking all the biggest ones out there. That's on average of the 100 berries that they select throughout the canopy. That's on the berry weight. As far as the bricks are, and remember, these are balanced vines at Clairol, or Cornell Lake Erie Research and Extension Laboratory in Portland, New York. We are, let me see, I don't know if I can give you an exact number, but we are showing above 16 bricks right now. He had mentioned, he being Dr. Terry Bates, says published research in New York, Concord, indicates that well-balanced vines with a Ravaz index of 15 or lower should reach 16 bricks approximately 28 days after veraison. So they've had research that has shown that, and he said 2022 is showing the same trend. So
That's less. Are we at 28 days or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Tuesday.
So it's right now.
Tuesday is 28 days.
Okay.
So
which is probably when this stuff got measured anyway. So it was probably right at 28 days.
Now you have me double checking.
So, right. So I think what that means, and I guess we'll know for real, I have seen emails from a couple of different processors that are concerned about opening up next week because of the bricks samples that they've seen their growers bring in. I hope or think, and maybe I shouldn't because I don't know enough, but I hope or think there's a selection process happening here where growers who are concerned about their bricks are bringing in what they're concerned about. Because I fully don't expect the industry to ripen as fast as our balanced prune stuff, because the industry isn't built on balanced pruning anymore. So we should need a few more days, and we've got almost an extra week or maybe a whole extra week before we're concerned at all. And we don't actually need to be at 16 bricks. There's no reason to be at 16 bricks. So we can actually be almost 2 weeks behind and still start harvesting on time behind the balanced prune stuff. So hopefully that's where we're at, and hopefully everything's ready to go next week. If I'm wrong, then they're more than 2 weeks behind.
Oh, yeah. And I did speak with some of our processors today, and yes, everybody's anticipating beginning Concords, finishing up Niagara's. Some have finished, and Concord starting next week.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like anybody's been nervous enough to actually delay harvest. Just that they are anticipating some load cancellation. They're anticipating a very normal first week, as opposed to, typically when we have very early veraison, coming off of a crop year like last year, so that crop potential is lower, we typically have a very easy first week compared to normal years. So they were anticipating a very normal first week where they were, rescheduling loads and canceling loads and moving and shifting them around to growers who had ripe fruit. But I guess, we don't have to guess. We can just wait and see. It's only a few more days.
Right. We'll let you know next week.
Right. I was just very surprised to hear that concern, because I just saw how our ripening curve and berry curve was coming along. So despite the fact that we were catching up and maybe even surpassing average berry size by the time we start harvesting, we were still accumulating bricks much faster than we needed to make minimum quality standards. So commercial grape growers don't need to accumulate faster than necessary. They just need to accumulate just enough. So there's no reason they need to hit 16 by even the 20th of September. I mean, 14.5 or 15 would be more than enough, depending on where you're marketing. So we'll see. But I was just surprised. That's all. So
going further on our crop update this week, and I know I touched base a little bit a lot on last week, but yes, New York Ag and Markets came out with their official release discussing that the spotted lantern fly is now in Western New York. I won't read the whole thing for you because it is in the crop update. So please feel free to peruse that. And I would just remind everybody to just be diligent while you're out there. You're going to be in your vineyards a lot these next coming weeks. Just take a look around. The adults are very noticeable. You're going to see them, especially if you disturb the canopy and they happen to be in there. They're going to be plopping out all over the place and trying to get away from you. So be diligent about looking for the adults. After leaf fall will be the best time to look for the eggs. And I know that sometimes you're tired, you're finished with harvest, you just want a little bit of a break. But if we can be out doing some scouting, maybe while you're looking for some broken posts or down wires after harvest, just peek around. Keeping our numbers low and being on top of it, I think, is the best way that we'll be able to manage these. But so far it was found in a
almost very urban area, certain industrial urban area.
Definitely. But the thing
and
that bothers me is that
no, what I would just say is we're going to keep every week. We'll let you know, because the whole point of asking you to scout is, and we're not going to say it was your farm, but the whole point of asking you to scout is if Ag and Markets, or if you, or if anybody finds them somewhere else, you need to be the first to know. And just, I think, get used to that update, because I don't think anybody's going to need to spray this year, but I don't know. And I think we could actually go through the same thing next year, where we're not really sure who's going to need to spray, if anybody needs to spray. It's going to take a lot of scouting. Is what I think is going to happen. So we will keep you posted. And then when you hear that, they're in the town of whatever, then you'll know that you may need to take a look and at particular blocks even, to see what you've got. But we haven't found anything yet.
No, we haven't found anything yet in our traps that we've been monitoring all season long. However, I would like to just maybe reiterate the fact that where we are finding this bug is near rail. So if you have rail that happens to traverse through your vineyard, maybe just start looking there, because they do happen to stop, and they have hitchhikers, and that is the way it seems to be spreading.
Right. Yeah. So this was a rail site. And, those rail sites, obviously, the ones that traveled to this Buffalo location obviously came through your vineyards. So, yep. And that's where you've got some traps on those rail lines. So
I do.
Nothing yet, but we could use more eyes and ears.
Absolutely. And if you do happen to find one, the website to report it is reportslf.com. Let me repeat that. reportslf.com. It's very important that you do that, because we can then track it and let in Ag and Markets, and everyone gets involved. So please, while you're looking, if you find it, report it. Okay, I've hammered that enough. I wasn't expecting to be here right now. I was really expecting to have to maybe be at the spot next year. Oh, we finally found one close to us, but it's coming a little bit faster than I anticipated.
Yeah, I guess it's not surprising. I think what probably happens is it's just so easy to find the adults.
Yes, I know.
You've got people like you who are really intently looking in certain places, but you obviously weren't checking rail yards in Buffalo. So they were here probably all year long, and they were probably really easy to find if you knew what you were looking for and you were actually looking in that location. So the same thing's going to happen next year, I bet, is if and where they expand to, you probably won't notice, unless it's a vineyard because you're paying attention, or the adults show up, and then it's just a lot easier to scout for them.
Well, that's where the first note in Buffalo, the first person to report it actually had grapes on an arbor in her backyard. And that's how she found it, as it fell on her. She was like, what is that? Okay. Luckily, she knew what it was after looking into it, because of a relative who does work with it. Grapevines near a rail station. So the next one that I need to talk about is Dr. Lynn Sinofsky, who is Cornell's weed scientist. She is asking for your input. In our crop update, there is a survey, because there has been a lot of herbicide resistance in New York. And you all know, you've called me and you've talked to me about, why can't I just get rid of some of these things? So if you would kindly, it is a very short survey. It's not a long one. I'm trying to find her words of how short this is. It says, this survey is very short and should be quick to answer. It is also completely anonymous. But your response to this very short and quick survey will help plan future research and extension projects. So please, and we've talked, a lot of you have some weeds that you're just having a hard time dealing with. Please try to do that. Click that link and take that survey.
Yep.
We also have NUA updates. So our Kim Knappenberger goes out and checks on our NUA stations and monitors them daily. So she has the little NUA update in there for you, as well as a VIP. VIP is a vineyard improvement program that is for Concord removal and some money for replant as well. We are currently asking for a no-cost extension due to COVID. So we weren't really able to get out and do business for about 1.5 years. So we're asking if they will extend those finances for 1.5 years. Please stay tuned. We're waiting on that response. I know there's a lot of you out there who are thinking of applying, but there might not be enough times. It does take about 1 year to complete that process. So this as is the grant terms on March 31st of 2023. So we are really trying to get that extended for you. Take advantage of that. If you have not already, contact Kim. The next thing is our CAPS. We have completed our CAPS program. CAPS is a grape commodity survey that Ag and Markets runs, where they give us pheromone lures and we put them out in nurseries and vineyards around our region. And we actually look for 3 separate invasive species. And we're happy to report that we never found one all season long. Thank goodness. And then we have Mr. Brian Head. He gave his update for PA and just all about the weather and how there's more rain in the week coming. I'm sorry about that, by the way. And that I didn't really read through it, but he is definitely, and he has seen it and we have talked about it. There's a lot of downy showing up out there. You can definitely eradicate it if you're going to, I don't know if he mentioned this, but this is from, oh, he did. This is from our conversation that we had. If you're willing to use copper, but copper will stop a fermentation. So make sure you harvest your fruit first and then apply the copper so that you can clean the leaves off and they can do a little more growing for the winter. I think that's it. Kevin, is there anything else that you want to? Oh, no, I'm sorry. The Efficient Vineyard is always a part of our crop updates on a weekly basis. There's going to be something about the Efficient Vineyard and how you can use that technology that was developed from the Efficient Vineyard project on your own vineyard management. Okay. Now I went through it.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen too much disease. I would expect one thing that I would watch for is secondary rots or something that looks like disease, because the pressure from grapeberry moth should continue. I talked to Ted this week and he was seeing not an unusual amount considering the conditions we have, but seeing probably more than he would like. Well, I shouldn't say he would like to see, because he likes to find it. Probably nobody likes to scout for it and find nothing, but more than you would want to see as a commercial grower. And, you know, because that pressure is constant at this point, and then certainly I think most Concord vineyards are reaching 15 bricks, you're going to see more secondary rots. And yeah, like Jen, you mentioned, we've already seen some, but I would scout for them, especially if next week everything is ripe. And then rather than, normally I think our simple advice is pick whatever is ripest, but I would pick whatever has the most berry moth pressure or rot pressure, especially if it's related to something that's going to get worse. Like if you go in there and there's a bunch of black rot, I don't know, you could probably hope, like if the berries haven't fallen off yet, maybe they will, because hopefully that pressure is gone and you've taken care of it since then. And certainly the berries are immune, obviously, at this point. But with grapeberry moth and the secondary rots associated with them, if you can scout for them and identify them, you know, pick them first and then they won't get worse. And that's always worked for Niagara. And the good news is Niagara's almost done. And probably by the time we meet back to here next week, the only Niagara that would be left would be stuff that for some reason gets a delayed harvest for wineries, but the major processors will be done with Niagara. So that's the first thing I would target when I saw secondary rots, and on purpose or inadvertently, that's what most people are going to do, because Niagara harvest is you know, mid-September this year, and nobody's trying to do it in October. So that should go really well. That's about all I have. I think
that's all I have as well.
We will see you next week. Thank you for joining us. And as always, if there's something you want us to discuss, or if it's something we don't know about, we can always bring on a guest. But if there's something you want us to discuss, please let us know.
Thanks
a lot for joining us,
everyone.